Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. When you're putting these programmes together, you sort of try and have a balanced display, and then every Thursday morning during the season, you have one or two little heart palpitations. And I have to say, Mike Roberts here was going to be here at 11 o'clock this morning. What time did the train get in? Yeah, so around about noonish, he finally turned up, and that was absolutely fine, no problem whatsoever. Frames went up, and then around about it was about just after 4:30. Mike says to me, "Have you seen Edward?" Edward who? Edward Klemke, who's going to give our vote of thanks today. No, I haven't seen him at all. So we said, well, okay. And so then I thought, what are we going to do now? And then I had a word with a warm deputy who was going to give the vote of thanks if necessary. And Edward was telephoned, and he said, I'm 10 minutes away in a cab. That was, what, half an hour ago, was it? Anyway, 2 minutes to 5, the chariot arrived and Mr. Klemke turned up. So thank you, Ed, for coming. Right, I digress. Mr. Coburn.
I hope this is working today, because the frog that got into my throat the other day and started eating away at my vocal cords has been expunged. But it's left me, to the great delight of my wife, rather quiet. Mr. President, guests, fellows and members, there are 105 people here today, which is a wonderful record. We have 6 guests, and we have one visitor from overseas with his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Van Dormelan, who we often see, but we're very delighted to see you again. There are no first-timers. Oh, hello. Good. Great. Your name, sir? Dean Shepherd. Ah, Dean. Dean Shepherd is here. Mr. Dean, nice to see you. If anybody can hear somebody shouting fire, get the hell out of it.
Thank you, Peter. No, I'm not going to go there today. I've seen this display once or twice, notably in Brazil, where it was in the frames, and I looked at it many times, because there weren't that many British exhibits there. There we go. I thought, this is wonderful. We've got to have this here. And Mike Roberts has duly delivered. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, fellows members. I'm Mike Roberts from Ilkley. There is another Mike Roberts, of course, from Yorkshire, and for those of you who expected him, I apologise. He's in Cockermouth tonight on a new pilgrimage, I understand. It is a new local stamp club. However, I thought I would start by giving everybody a flavour of what the Falkland Islands is actually like before launching into some of the finer points of the postal history. So the first few slides are pictures that I've taken when I've been down there. I've visited the islands on 3 occasions. The first in 1999 and the last was last year in their summer. I have got family interest in that my great uncle was the colonial manager in the Falklands in the late 40s and was the captain of one of the supply ships, the Fitzroy, which is featured in the display. So that is the reason, apart from being a postal historian and being a collector, that I started my interest in the Falkland Islands. So we open with a slide, an iconic image in the end of Stanley Harbour, and it's not the SS Great Britain, which of course is in Bristol. This is the Lady Elizabeth, which is a bark which came to grief just over 100 years ago and has been in the harbour since 1913. The Falkland Islands is all about ships and shipping, because that was its importance certainly up to 1914. In 1914, of course, that was when the Panama Canal opened and the islands were virtually cut off from the main shipping lanes. But before that, most of the ships that went into the Pacific that chose to go round Cape Horn, if they got into difficulties, Port Stanley was the first port of relief. So the islands themselves grew in importance for that reason. We can go into the details earlier on of the importance of American whalers, but that is an earlier story and something I'll come to in the postal history section. So we've got ships, we've got two businesses, the Falkland Island Company and J.M. Dean and Sons, which made money out of the leaky ships and distressed ships coming around the Horn. And then we had the export of wool, which to this day still goes on, and the wool goes into Bradford Wool Exchange. The economy of the Falklands now, the GDP is roughly 100 million, and the GDP per capita is quite a bit higher than it is in the UK, but the growth is very spasmodic. They had 3 years of very good growth and it slowed down considerably. We've got issues regarding oil exploration, which has now become important, but of course the oil price has gone down and therefore it's going to take some time for that to recover and for the exploration to go ahead. So a few iconic images. Government House as it is now, some king penguins at Volunteer Point, and the remains of Bodie Creek Suspension Bridge, which was a shortcut on the eastern side, on East Falkland. It's now derelict and unused, but when I first went in 1999, you could walk across it. They used to drive sheep across it, and it saved 40 miles. Here we've got the monument to the Battle of the Falkland Islands on the left, the post office, which should be important to all of us, in the top right, and on Victory Green, 2 upland geese and the mizzenmast of the Great Britain, which is still down there, obviously. So, a quick timeline for those who aren't knowledgeable about the particular history. 1592 saw John Davis in the ship Desire first saw the Falkland Islands. And for those of you who know Dartmouth, he used to live on a small cottage which is still there on the south end of Dartmouth Promenade, and it has one of those blue plaques saying John Davis lived here. It's in the handout. What I'd pick out from this slide is that people do not realise that in 1764 the first establishment of a settlement was actually French, not English. The French established a settlement at Port Louis in East Falkland a matter of months before the British started a settlement at Port Egmont in West Falkland. And for some considerable time, one didn't know that the other was there. Once they discovered it, there was some very quick and vigorous diplomatic exchanges. But the French did sell their interest to Spain for £25,000 in 1767, and it is that which is the basis of the Argentine claim for the Falkland Islands. 1771 saw further vigorous diplomatic exchanges between Britain and Spain, but Britain again prevailed. There is an extract from a newspaper of the time there which goes into some brief detail about it. But there wasn't very much that people could do with the islands then. The only visitors were basically American whalers, and that was on a very spasmodic basis. So the British withdrew in 1774 because basically on economic grounds. And there followed a period of about 50 years, I've said there, a lawless period with no formal government, when whalers came and went. There was a lot of wild cattle left there, and whalers used to go and fill their kitchens and use it for water as well. And in 1826, the United Provinces of the River Plate, which were the successors to Spain, appointed a guy called Louis Vernet as governor. And he was quite a high-handed chap. And several years later, he arrested some American whalers who were there minding their own business, as they thought. And the Americans didn't like it. So what do? They send a gunboat. So the USS Lexington went into Port Louis Harbour and levelled it. They didn't kill anybody, but there isn't anything left other than a few foundations. And as a result of that, the British got fed up with, the fact that we thought it was ours, and therefore they reclaimed sovereignty by way of Captain Onslow. HMS Clio arrived on the 2nd of January 1833. Since then, it has been a British dependency, sovereign territory, and fully occupied. So there we are. That's a bit of a history lesson. This is an impression of the first settlement at Port Louis in 1764, and the photograph of the right is as it is today, well, as it was last year. The capital then moved from Port Louis to Stanley. However, before we get to that, this is the details of the British settlement, which is at Port Egmont in West Falkland. You'll find in your handout that there is a map, and you'll be able to see where these places are. And these are the plaques which were restored by Governor Tatum in 1995. There's a small cemetery there, and we visited it. This is in 1999, I think. And this is all that remains. There's just a small relic here. And the relic that's standing there is sitting on the front row here, Mr. Osborne. A map from the Gentleman's Magazine of 1776. Now, basically, this, just to reiterate, Stanley's over here, Port Louis is there, Egmont is up here, and the two other post offices, there's Fox Bay there and New Island right into the west. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about some what I call important Falkland personalities. All these people are addressees on some of the covers that are in the display. Left to right, Samuel Fisher Lafone, described by some as a South American cattle killer, is actually a Scouser. He never visited the Falkland Islands, but he founded the Falkland Island Company. And he used an agent to do all his dirty work for him in the islands. Next we have W.M. Dean. J.M. Dean and Sons were the principal competitors to the Falkland Island Company. And because they operated locally, didn't have to go back to London for instructions. Therefore, he managed to undercut the FIC on all sorts of things and did extremely well. Was eventually bought out by the FIC, but much later on. Next in order, George Travis. Well, David Beach, I know, will know exactly who George Travis is, given the fact that he wrote a book on it following a very famous find going back to 1977. Yeah. We've got a couple of examples in the display. He was a very well-known postmaster, but had also been a finance clerk and collector of customs. And finally, F.E. Cobb was not only the manager of the FIC between 1867 and 91, he did all sorts of radical things to improve farming, and he became the director, London-based, and was responsible for buying out Dean Brothers. Again, you'll find a number of covers addressed to him. Getting on to the postal communication, I mean, the main route down from the UK via Lisbon, Tenerife, Cape Verde, 3 of the ports in Brazil, and then Montevideo and Buenos Aires, and then a branch packet down to the Falkland Islands. That was the case from about 1808. Now, this is where I depart from the script, because this says the postal history of the Falkland Islands between the years 1827 and 1945. I knew that there was one cover that was in existence prior to 1827. I knew it was coming up at Grosvenor Auctions 2 weeks ago, and I didn't dare to think what might happen. But fortunately, the gods were with me, and it's here. Now that predates by 27 years the second oldest cover from the Falkland Islands. Significantly, it's to do with, we believe, the American whaling presence, although I've not yet proved that. It took an inordinate length of time to get back to New York, but I did discover through Lloyd's List that the reason for that was that the route included Cape Town, so it had gone right across from the Falkland Islands to Cape Town, up Africa, and it didn't get back into the UK until the 8th of November before it went across the Atlantic. So there we are. That's a new find for me, although it's been on the radar, so to speak, since the mid-70s. But in America, it hasn't been to the UK before. This is the second earliest one. This is significant because we know it was written from Port Louis. It's in French, it's sent by a French surgeon, and it is addressed to France. The only one, I believe, that is so addressed. Now, moving on, the first frame has 9 ship letters in it of various sorts. But this highlights an particular interest I have in in-depth research. This was the cover on the left is from New Ireland, and it's dated March the 25th, 1849. It has a full letter describing the whaling operations of Hiram Clift. The letter is written to his brother back in Mystic Bridge in Connecticut. Having been to the Mystic Museum in Connecticut, they managed to get a glass slide of him taken in 1860, which I just think is a remarkable thing, to be honest. To be able to have a picture of somebody who wrote a letter from the Falkland Islands in 1849. However, there we are. I digress. It is in frame 1. The other cover that I illustrate there is an example, in fact the only example, of a consignee letter in the 19th century. That was a colonial manager of Stanley to the FIC in London. And then lastly, on the shipping side of things, private ships that is, this is an example of an inward cover which was dispatched from Chile to Shallow Bay, which is a small settlement in West Falkland, and one where you can now stay, and this is the original settlement house. That was dispatched by private ship. Now, before we go on, well, we're going to go on to packet letters now rather than ship letters. And the early mail was basically taken to Montevideo by 2 FIC schooners, the Foam and the Black Hawk. Now these are examples of 2 early packet letters. The one on the left is at the rate of 2 7p per half ounce, and that's via Buenos Aires. Now that's the second one that I acquired. The first one I acquired was an inward one on the right hand side, which was sold to me as also 2 7p, and I looked at it and I thought, that doesn't look like, it looks like 2 9 to me. And it took a long time for me to find it, but there is a post office notice going back to 1841 which says that the rate for packet using the Rio de Janeiro post office is 2 9, but if you go via Buenos Aires it's 2 7, which is counterintuitive given the fact that Buenos Aires is further down. But there we are. I've got a few examples of incoming packet letters by Royal Mail, the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, and I've just illustrated some of my favourites. An octuple rate with two bobs on it, and the one I really love, which is that uprated penny pink. Now that's written by George Travis and sent to Fred Cobb, 2 of the people who I'd outlined as being important in the first few slides. Now, we're probably on to the subject that most people know about, because it's probably more famous than any other Falkland Island marking, and that's the Black Franc. This small rectangular black paid marking, which was first seen in 1869. Bear in mind, before that time, there were no markings in the Falklands at all. So the only way you could establish if a letter had come from the Falkland Islands was it would by the content. And likewise, for letters going into the Falklands, there is no way you're going to get a receiving mark because they didn't have any. So from 1869, when there was paid postage, we've got about 50 known Black Franc covers that have been documented. I've illustrated 3 types. The rate, there was a special rate to Montevideo of 4p. At the bottom there is the normal rate of 6p per half ounce, and then plus 4p registration. And in the frames you'll also find one that's come from Speedwell Island, because I've got the cover going back the other way. And Speedwell Island is a very, very small island to the southeast of East Falkland, and there was only 4 people who lived there. Anyway, the Black Franc wasn't totally successful. George Travis didn't like it, so he decided that he'd replace it with something big and more ostentatious, and therefore it was replaced with the red circular franc. And those, there are about just over 20 of those, of which one only is addressed to somewhere outside the UK. That's it. It's in the frames opposite. There's a story behind this, because there was a famous collector dealer who allegedly found it in a sideboard when he was trying to buy a dining room suite in the 1920s. And he tried, well, he did buy it, but he bought the dining room suite because he found a red franc in one of the drawers, and promptly sold it to the dining room suite back to the underbidder, so got that for nothing. Whether that story is right, I don't know, but it's been reported by one of our members of our study group as being authentic. Now, 1870, 1878. Thank you. Brings us to the first postage stamps of the Falkland Islands. Now, you will appreciate that I'm not a philatelist, I'm a postal historian, so that'll upset a few people. But I did think it was important to highlight this because there were just 4 values that were produced at different dates in 1878 and 1879. They used this Herbert Bourne head that was previously used in the Transvaal, which you will probably recognise. And broadly speaking, the stamps were cancelled using 2 methods. One, there was a Falkland Islands steel obliterator, which is you see there on the left. But for a long period of time, more than 10 years, there was a series of handmade cork cancels, and they frequently appear on covers with no CDSs, so you wouldn't otherwise be able to tell what the date was. But through the major researches of predecessors in the Falkland Islands Study Group, people like Malcolm Barton, who some of you may know, and Bob Barnes, they were able to establish by reference to the type of cork what the dates were. So that is a relevant topic. It's been one that's been studied by a number of people, and there are a number of different cork examples in the display. So first, stamps on cover. A couple of examples. I mean, the main rate was 4p, so that's what you're going to find on a letter, whether it's to the UK or to the US or indeed any other part of the world. So we've got the earliest known example of 4p on cover, which was to Norfolk on the left, and a later example to San Francisco on the right. Moving swiftly ahead, in 1891, of course, there was a reduction in the postage in the empire, and from the 1st of January 1891, the 4p rate was reduced to 2p halfpenny. However, the ship that was taking the Falkland Island halfpenny and 2p halfpenny stamps came to grief. So when it came to the January 1891, they had no halfpenny and 2p halfpenny stamps, so they had to have an unofficial bisect. That is one of the 3 known bisect notices, signed by Fred Shedden Sanguinetti, who was then the postmaster in Stanley. And I have gone on to show 3 or 4 examples of the bisects on cover using, in this case, actual surcharged examples, but most of the bisects that you see from the Falklands are actually unsurcharged. This is of particular interest because it comes from West Falkland rather than East Falkland, and I've been able to identify both the sender and the receiver. The first major mail contract was that the Cosmos line, and that took effect in 1880. It was a German steamship company. It worked very well, but they got basically more and more, that is to say the British got, and the Falkland Islanders got more and more frustrated about the contract after about 1895 for political reasons, and wanted it replaced with a British company. But Cosmos played a very important role in being the first major company to transmit mail to and from the Falklands. So I've illustrated this with one or two covers. Some are on Port Stanley Agency Cosmos notepaper, and one particular attractive one there where I speculate that that was the governor sending to Boston for a new pair of slippers. The reason I say it was a new pair of slippers was Bird and Stevens, if you Google it, they say they're slipper manufacturers of Boston. So he may very well have put his soles of his shoes or something like that in that envelope and sent it off and said, can I have some slippers that'll fit? Who knows? It's a nice thing. One of the idiosyncrasies of the Cosmos line was that because they had steamers that were going all the way around South America and up into Chile and back again, it was possible if you couldn't meet the right dates to transship mail at Punta Arenas, and that's an example of a piece of mail that went from Punta Arenas to Stanley, having gone from Buenos Aires down the coast on the incoming steamer and then out on the outgoing steamer. Imperial Penny Post, 25th of December 1898. I suppose you could say that's the first day cover from the Falkland Islands there. It enclosed a full letter, and it says, I also hope this is the last letter I ever post in this one-sided, backbiting, never to be forgotten spot on the Earth's surface. So he clearly didn't like it very much. Now, I did allude to the fact that Cosmos became unpopular. They were replaced by the Pacific Steam Navigation Company, who had a contract between 1900 and 1911. I've illustrated that with some covers and cards in the frames. I'm also conscious that if I'm not careful, I'm going to overrun. So, separate subject, earliest known internal mail. There were no formal internal mail arrangements in the Falklands until 1891. There are only 3 known covers that we've been able to find prior to 1891, and they're all here. This is 1847. That's from the Governor Moody to Richard Williams. He was the agent for all the Laphones. Now, the local mail service was very important when it became formalised, and there were a number of recognised mail boats. And these are some examples of those which had their own councillors. So the top right is actually done in manuscript, but the others, RMS Columbus, which was in service for about 3 years, RMS Falkland, which had 2 hand stamps. None of these are known on cover yet. And importantly, the Afterglow, which was basically a seal protection vessel, where the gunner had authority to act as a postmaster. And it had initially its own straight line canceller. That is the only cover that survived with that cancellation. We don't know what the numbers are. Maybe it's something to do with Mr. Cobb's sheep. I don't know, but there we are. The first telegram that was used to transmit a message from New Ireland to a factory ship in Port Stanley Harbour, and 2 examples of what is sometimes described as outlying residence postage due. Because they lived in remote farm settlements, they deposited money at the post office, initial the stamps that they'd paid for, and the stamps were then put on with outgoing and incoming letters as necessary by the postmaster in Stanley. The Falkland Islands was a well-known stopping off point for numerous expeditions. In the early 1900s, so I've got examples from the Swedish Antarctic Expedition, the Scottish National Expedition, the British Graham Land Expedition, and Operation Tabarin in February 1944. They're all written up in the frames. A few examples of special rates and treatments. Again, they're up in the frames, but the one of those which I would probably highlight would be the one in the bottom left, where we have the Falkland Island Post Office crown in black actually cancelling the stamps. The others are pretty self-explanatory. Now, the one in the centre is sent by Governor Allardyce from Government House. It had a number of very sensitive things in it, but it wasn't censored, presumably because he decided he didn't want to censor his own letters, but there you are. Censorship was in operation in early 1915. Moving swiftly on, airmail. Well, we say, well, we're only going up to 1945, and as the Falkland Islands didn't have an airport till 1971, what on earth are you talking about? But basically, there was airmail down to South America. It just did the last bit by sea between Montevideo and Stanley. So the important things there are that there was, albeit I think philatelically inspired, a first airmail internal delivery in November 1934 as a result of the visit of HMS Exeter. And HMS Exeter had a catapult walrus aircraft which was used to send 6 covers between Stanley and some of the outlying farm settlements. One of them, examples, is there, as is an example of Zeppelin mail, as is some of the examples of mails through the Lufthansa and Air France routes. There we are, those are illustrated. And these are some of the commercial covers that follow the formal airmail service starting in August 1944. Those are proper commercial rates, and they use, pound stamps, 10 bob stamps. That's the first time that I've been able to get hold of something of that high face value that was properly used rather than philatelically used. Censorship, World War II, usual thing could be Falkland Islands had their own censor labels, but there are many examples which were censored elsewhere. One there on the right-hand side that was censored on an incoming letter because the doctor in Darwin was actually a German. Importantly, there were 3 methods in World War II of sending privilege mail. One was if it was on Red Cross business. One was if it was evacuee mail, that is to say, when the Japanese came into the war, there was concern that they'd come round Cape Horn and invade, so the children were evacuated from Stanley into the camp. And if the children sent a letter back to their parents, it would pass through the post office post-free, provided it had evacuee written on it. The example on the right-hand side, the Fellowship of the Bellows, was an organisation that contributed, I think, a penny for every German aircraft that was shot down and reported on the BBC. And they did eventually were responsible for actually buying a Spitfire called the Falkland Islands. But if it had the Fellowship of the Bellows cachet, it was entitled to pass through the post office at no charge. Quickly, Fox Bay, that's what Fox Bay Post Office looks like now. Not very inspiring, but nevertheless, it does have some interesting postal history. They had their own councillor going back to 1899. And then there was what was called the Fox Bay Gap between 1904 and 1914. We didn't quite know what was happening. The item on the right was sent by Stanley Turner, who was not only the doctor in Stanley, but he was also the postmaster and had a number of other jobs. And that basically records the canceller that he had in his possession, which we thought was previously used in Port Stanley Post Office. So some examples of Argentine mail, internal mail to Stanley on a commercial envelope. And then lastly, the New Ireland Post Office was very important from a point of view of whaling. This was the centre of the commercial whaling station owned by Christian Salveson. Basically started in 1909. They did eventually move all their equipment to South Georgia, but before they opened the post office, they got a blind canceller, and the cancellation was done by manuscript in the centre. That's the only known copy of one that's tuppence halfpenny rate, which is the foreign rate to Sweden. There's one of the other four that are known, New Ireland cancellations to Norway on a postcard. And to finish with, one of my favourites, this has gone from Easter Island on a small yawl which was rescued by a whaler from New Ireland, towed into New Ireland, where this letter was put in the post, cancelled New Ireland, and sent back to London. The addressee was described as purveyors of Easter Island images. This is going back to 1911. So this yawl, Pandora, was eventually repaired, and she made her way by way of Tristan da Cunha, Ascension Island, to New York, where New York Times did a full article on her. She then departed after another month, and she was never seen again. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call on the late Edward Klemke.
Members, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I've got to know Mike quite well over the last few years because we were both made redundant roughly at the same time. And we did confer with each other about our payoff. And that was quite a decent thing to do. But I think it's fair to say, Mike, if you actually was to saw you in half, you'd find the words Falkland Isles embedded in his bones. Michael has collected this stuff to such a degree that tonight's collection is possibly the finest that will ever be assembled. The early material, the percentages of the known covers that are here is phenomenal. The later material, again, is all very much very highly prized. And Michael's got us all trained because nowadays, every time I look at an auction catalogue, I always look and see if it's addressed to the Falkland Isles. And of course, there was two covers that I did find, one with a seahorse on, and one with, it had gone via the Zeppelin. And both these covers had been sold. So it was left to me to actually barter with a dealer to buy them back off the collector who bought them. And that was on behalf of Mike, so that's how well he's got us trained. The Falkland Isles, really, you know, when you look at them, these little small islands, thousands of miles from anywhere, but yet they've got such an affection in our heart. And that's possibly emanating from the Falklands War. But when you talk to Mike and you talk to him about the study circle, the number of members in the study circle for such a small place, there's hundreds of members. And when you contrast that with some of the bigger countries, and you know, you're struggling to get 100, 200 members, and the Falklands is just so appreciated by collectors that it's incredible, it really is. But tonight's display is undoubtedly one of the more superb we'll ever see of this area. And I think it's a fitting tribute that Mike spent the time to actually publish what is a very nice little handout. But it's a lasting memory, it's a lasting record of Mike's wonderful collection. And you should be very proud of that, Mike. I'm very proud of your collection. So thank you for showing us it too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Questions from the floor? Any questions for Mike? The harder the better, please.
Well, that's good.
No speakers? I can't remember the last time we had no questions. You were very robust. That's all, we're all dying for thirst. Thank you. Plaquette. Time-honoured tradition.
I'll take this off.
Please do. I'll come out the front. A little memento of the society. Thank you very much indeed, Mike.
Thank you.
Splendid.
Thank you very much.
Truly wonderful. Thank you.
you.
One for the camera. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done, Mike.
Thank you.
And the black box, please. And the certificate as well. As you probably gathered, I haven't quite got organised yet. Now, most unusually, we're going to present a medal to the vote of thanks giver. Please don't expect every time you get a vote of thanks given, you're going to get a medal. Edward, the Tilliard Medal, which is this wonderful, I hesitate to use the word gold, but gold-coloured medal, which silver gilt, is it? Thank you, Chris. Edward gave a wonderful display 2nd of October 2014. I'm sure many of us were here. Great Britain Postal History 1840 to 1854, shown before the Society. Sadly, Edward was unable to make it to the last AGM, and it was awarded the best paper of the year, for which Edward won this medal. So would you just like to step forward, please, Edward? Take that off. Photo with John. Thank you. Well done, Edward. Right. A few more notices. First of all, those of you looking at your watches will realise it's probably 10 to lunchtime in New York. So if any American visitors are actually not eating their turkey, can I wish them happy Thanksgiving? So thank you very much for joining us. The next meeting. I got a little bet with myself that the next meeting here will actually break the attendance record. Currently that's, I think, 202, is it, or thereabouts, the British West Indies, when they had a collective display. But on the 10th of December, we've got the Great Britain Philatelic Society having their 60th birthday party. There will be 40 or 50 people bringing displays. And I think with everybody clamouring for the mince pies as well, we could have a bumper attendance. So can I urge you to come early if you want to get a mince pie? So 10th of December, you know where to come. Those of you who've been in the building on non-meeting days of the last month will have enjoyed Lubor Kunc, his standing display Austro-Hungarian field post 1914 to 1918. We're delighted to say that Lubor's come over from Prague and is actually with us today. I can't see him. Is he here? Lubor, yes. Thank you, Lubor. Most of our standing display givers normally receive a certificate by the post, but as Lubor's here, I thought I'd give you a week early. So well done, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. The next standing display is by David Gurney, former secretary here, on-secretary here. During the calendar month of December, illustrated and advertising letters used from and to the Channel Islands and letter forwarding agents of Great Britain handling Channel Island letters 1716 to 1855. Now that title takes the first whole frame. But I'm sure it'll be splendid. Thank you, anticipation for that from David. it only remains for me to say thank you all for your attendance. I apologise for the heat. It seems to get warmer and warmer. You shouldn't be such a good display. You get so many people turning up. Therefore, we get the heat coming up. Suffice to say, wine and refreshments are now available downstairs. We are now at 10 to 6. Half an hour left in the frames, Mike. Is that okay with you? Yes? So half an hour more to enjoy it. Thank you very much for coming. See you downstairs shortly. Thank you.